All right. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight for this. And I got to say, a history major from Vassar is only slightly intimidated by all you MIT people here. But I actually am very proud, in fact, in my own way, to not be a scientist or an engineer, because it's actually given me an opportunity to have a different perspective on a lot of what you all work on and what I cover as a journalist. In fact, I'm a sort of, dyed-in-the-wool generalist. And what I mean by that is, as a journalist, I kind of perch myself at that proverbial 35,000-foot view. And I can look down and see connections. And I didn't realize this when I started, but you end up as a journalist talking to everyone. You don't just stay in your silo. I'll do a story on genetics, but I'll also talk to any number of other scientists, maybe regulators, politicians, lawyers. And it's ended up giving me over the years the great privilege of meeting lots of people in these different walks of life and starting to make some interesting connections. And what I'm going to talk to you tonight is partly about life extension, but it's also some other future trends that I see in the life sciences. And this is coming, by the way, also as a journalist, one as a skeptic. And for many years, I've been a critic of a lot of sort of out there predictions, scientists who say, we're going to do X, Y, Z, like say triple lifespan or something. One expresses a certain amount of skepticism as a journalist. That's what we're trained to do. So I'm coming to you tonight to talk to you about some of these trends, really having come to believe, spending time with other skeptics, other people who are optimists, pessimists, and others, that some of these technologies I'm going to describe to you may actually happen. And in fact, what we probably should be focusing on as much as the technologies is in what comes next. And to start here, along those lines, I'm going to ask you all a question and get you engaged here. I know you've been at work all day. You're kind of sitting back here saying, okay, I don't have to do any work. He's going to do all the talking. But I am going to ask you one question, which is a pretty important one. And in fact, it's sort of asking, what is this whole life science effort that we've been involved with, many of us here in this room and in the Valley here and lots of other places around the world? What happens if we sort of succeed with this multi-trillion-dollar effort? And so I've asked about, I think we're up to over 40,000 people now, and you all will be counted in that. How long do you want to live? And just to make it easy so it can be quantified, I'm sure you all have your individual ages you might be thinking about as, and I'm not going to call on you, so don't worry, unless you want to be called on. But I'm going to separate this to 4 different possible answers just so we can compare it to the other people I've asked. So the first answer is 80 years, or the first possible answer you might want to vote for, and I will ask for a show of hands in a moment here. 80 years is about the life expectancy in the U.S. right now. It's around 79 or so. So that would be people that are satisfied basically with what the average lifespan is in the U.S. Although because we all survived childhood, we actually have a slightly longer lifespan. 120 years, which is about as long as any human has ever lived. In fact, the longest lived person, which you'll see a picture of in a little bit, is Jeanne Clément, who was a French woman who lived to be 122. And about 5 days shy of 123. She died in 1997. So this is about as long as the human organism, as far as we know, will live, about 120 years. And then 150 years. Now, this would assume there's probably some scientific fix, genetics, something like that. I'm not telling you that there is, though. In fact, there are no caveats here at all. You are free to imagine that there's a science or a pill or something that will get you to that, or not. That may be why you wouldn't vote for it, because you don't believe that will happen. So finally, forever. And I do help out over at Singularity University sometimes, which is sort of misnamed, really. In fact, Peter Diamandis, the founder, had said it should have been called Exponential University, because it's really about exponential technologies. But my friends over there, you can imagine what they vote for when I ask this question at Singularity University. So how many people vote for 80? Okay. We are in Silicon Valley. Optimists, yes. How about 120? Okay. And you,
Can we do an in-between?
You know, I started at 80 and then 120. I'm sorry. I wish I'd put 100 in because that's probably about what my vote would be. But, okay, 100. Let's ask for 100. Okay. Now, you guys can't fit in the survey but I know. 150? Okay, we got a few optimists out there. I think we've covered most people by now, though. Anybody forever? Well, I shouldn't have spoken. Okay. And by the way, this is one of the few places in the world, sometimes you get it depending on where you are in, say, Boston, and usually you find out it's California people that are voting forever in Boston. I don't know what it is out here, but anyway, I'll share with you. This is, I'm actually writing a thriller right now, so I'm leaving you with a cliffhanger. You'll find out later in the talk how your votes compared to the other 40,000 people. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about, and I'm going to go pretty fast here, although you guys are really smart, so it won't matter. In fact, I hope that I have enough crazy data and all of that in here for everybody. So I'm going to deal with 3 different topics here. And mostly, I'm going to get to the radical longevity stuff at the end, but I'm going to mostly talk to you about what most of my writing and work is really about at Berkeley and et cetera, about something called personalized health. I'll explain that in a minute, what I mean by that. And then human enhancement, we'll jump into that. I've been doing a kind of informal series for the New York Times on bioenhancement, Lance Armstrong plus, that sort of thing, and way beyond. So we'll talk about that for a minute, and then we'll get into the radical longevity. And there is a sort of arc here. These are all somewhat related. But these are what I see in my line of work as being 3 huge trends. Especially that first one is the low-hanging fruit at the moment, personalized health. So we'll start with that. This is my family. It could be your family. Personalized health, obviously, with the word personalized, it's all about treating us individually. And you've heard of personalized medicine. I view personalized medicine as just a subset of personalized health. Personalized health is about staying healthy. Personalized medicine is what happens once you get sick. And in fact, almost all of our health care right now should be called sick care, because it's really about what happens after you get sick. And there's very, very little about keeping you healthy. Now, many of us in the wellness movement, if you will, go out on our own and try to stay as healthy as we possibly can, learn what we can. There's a whole industry around that. But in fact, what we really want to focus on here is using all of these new technologies, and some of which I'm going to tell you about here, which is now allowing us to do a lot more in this personalized health space, staying healthy, predictive markers and genetics, things like that. And in fact, to give you a little example of what the problem is at the moment, the kind of lack of personalized health, personalized medicine. By the way, there's a new term now. I always love this as a journalist. They come up with new terms every so often. I don't know why. They have to rebrand things. It's like a new Coke or something. Now it's called precision medicine. And it's really sort of the same thing. They called it rational drug development at one point. It's all in the same kind of theme, and it's all about trying to really tailor and individualize care based on your physiology, your body, your genetics, as opposed to one-size-fits-all, which is the way most medicine is practiced. And in fact, this chart is kind of interesting. It shows you how many of the major drug categories that we have out there, how many people that they work for. And you can see, even at the very top there, like say statins, that's only about 75% of the people that take statins, the drug actually works. The drugs actually work. When you start moving down that chart and you get into things like ACE inhibitors or, God forbid, incontinence, you're down 40% or less. And of course, cancer famously is 20% or so or less. Although the interesting thing is, especially about cancer, which I think you all have had a presentation about recently, there are some exciting things happening there in personalized health and medicine that are beginning to be able to target these drugs using genetic tests, so that you go from 20%, I did an article on this recently, a drug for lung cancer, in fact, with a companion marker, genetic marker, it works for 85% of the people who go into full remission. And this is only about 5% of lung cancer patients, but that is personalized health and medicine as opposed to this sort of impersonalized medicine, if you will, that we practice today. And just rifling through some of these new technologies that are going to help us get to a world of personalized health. You've got genetics, and I'll get into some of these in more detail in a minute. Proteomics, this is actually, believe it or not, although it looks like a star system or something, that is my blood proteome, which, as Jenny mentioned, I've been tested every which way, including my proteins. Now, if I had cancer or major cancer markers or proteins floating around in my blood, they would have little red dots in there, so thank goodness I don't have that. You've got the microbiome, which has become very big deal just recently. I couldn't sell a story in the microbiome if my life depended on it 3 years ago. My editors looked at me like, what? Bugs in your gut? What's that? And now suddenly it's a big deal. There are cover stories everywhere, which is kind of the weird way my business works. You've got pharmaceuticals, you've got crazy new scanning technologies, nanotechnology, synthetic engineering, and then you've got a whole new range of biosensors, which are very exciting. And I'm somewhat involved with the quantified self movement, if you've heard about that. It's literally a bunch of crazy people like me that go out and test themselves every which way. And there are now, I think, something like 40 chapters globally. And you may even see notices about meetings here in the area where people present new ways that they're using technology, and sometimes very low tech, to measure themselves. But there are a lot of companies now that are developing products. Like, does anybody here have a Fitbit? Anybody use a Fitbit? Anybody know what a Fitbit is? These measure your steps if you're running or walking, and nobody really knows what exactly it means other than, like, okay, I did better today than yesterday, which is a problem with some of these technologies. You know, collecting a lot of data, don't really know exactly what it means. But this is some Fitbit technology. This is actually a glucose monitor that one can wear for several days, and it's downloading. It's sensing levels of glucose and injecting insulin as needed. This is called Zeo, which is one of the many new little pieces of headgear with electrodes where you can measure brainwave patterns at night. Again, nobody really knows exactly what it means for a person at home collecting brainwave data every day or every night. You know, most of the data is around going to a sleep clinic and getting hooked up with, 70 electrodes on a little cap. And, again, a problem because a lot of data being collected, but the technology is certainly there. This is actually a test being administered to Colbert that has to do with hearing. It's a sort of suite of tests and sensors that are in this iPhone, which they had some fun with on the Colbert Show. They have body fat analyzers, and in all my testing, this is one that I don't really want to know, but some people do, so that's available. In a lot of hospitals now, actually still too few, but many of them now, you will actually walk in and see doctors using iPads instead of pencil and paper. And so that's obviously a new development. And then you've got all kinds of apps. In fact, we were just trying one. This is a portable EKG, which I have on my phone on the back here. You can put your fingers on these sensors, and I can do, basically a clinical grade EKG. And I was testing Margaret Hamburg, the FDA commissioner, the other day. I just happened to be sitting next to her at a dinner, and her pulse was way high. She's going, I said, should we know something? Is something wrong here? Are you nervous? Are you stressed? Being the commissioner of the FDA, that's what we figured it probably was, or maybe a slightly stressful job. Anyway, a little characterization here of how we might look one day once we're being measured every which way. You've also got, as I've mentioned, all kinds of organizations now that are really almost movements, taking bits and pieces of these new technologies and people getting very excited and having meetings and conferences. The Quantified Self, in fact, next week is the Health 2.0 meeting, which you all may have heard of. This is a group that they all started small, but I think it's about 3,000 people will gather down in Santa Clara. And it's mostly IT people. In fact, this is really driven by IT people, a lot more than biologists, which I'll talk about in a sec. But these are IT people realizing that this is the next wave of it's where the action is, much like the internet was 10 or 12 years ago. And they're still trying to figure it out because they're IT people and not biologists. And I keep telling the Health 2.0 organizers, I do the future of medicine segment at this meeting, but I can't get them to invite scientists. It's like, okay, you guys are really good at creating cool apps and things, but at a certain point you have to interface with the biological and biomedical community. Some great books, if you haven't read this or seen it. Eric Topol, he's a fabulous cardiologist and he's a very good writer, and he writes a lot about this in a very accessible way, even if you aren't an expert. Magazines are talking about this. Groups like Future Med, which I'm involved with, Singularity. There are incubators all over the place. Rock Health is having its demo day, in fact, tomorrow, which is a great local incubator here for life science companies. There are many companies, Genamera being one. And then for those of you that are interested in what the market might look like for this is not a business talk, but it does give you, if you look at the details here, and I'm happy to get this slide to people if you want to see it. Between 2009 and 2015, according to Pricewaterhouse, they actually put together all the components of the personalized health market, which is everything from going to a gym to stem cell therapies. And they characterize this just a couple of years from now as being a $450 billion market. So when I talk to business audiences, eyes sort of light up a little bit here. And it's a big challenge to try to wrestle that down and figure out how to fund it, how to make sense of it. But that's the scale of what we're talking about with these technologies. Now, I'm going to give you a little example of one man's journey here into some of these technologies. As Jenny mentioned, starting in 2001, where I did a Wired story, where I was given an assignment to write about something called the Human Genome Project, I thought, what? Human genome? Okay, genetics? And me trying to understand it, I actually talked one of the leading scientists in the Human Genome Project, Charlie Cantor, to sequence me. And I didn't know it at the time, but I guess I was the first person to ever really be sequenced, other than Craig Venter, as we found out later, had secretly sequenced himself for his own version of the Human Genome Project. But so we had a couple hundred markers. I wrote it up in a Wired story, and it really clicked because I'm basically a storyteller. And even though I'm interested in these technologies, I'm more interested in telling you a story and making sense of this. So this is a great way to tell this story, and I kind of went nuts after that. For the last, 12 years or so, I literally have gotten virtually every test you can possibly get. And in fact, I have to turn a lot of them away. People want me to take this and that. But I wrote a book and really established this project, which is ongoing, and thousands of labs all over the world, companies, over 30,000 genotypes annotated, which means genetic traits identified. And there's a program, I can give you the URL, it's actually not on the slides here. It's publicly available, which I don't know what I was thinking, but you can actually look up and see. And we have a program that every time a new study is entered into the literature, it automatically adds, we have little bots floating around, it automatically adds that study to my results. And so every time I look, there are more and more and more. But I will give you a little clue as to how well this information works and how useful it is. It has not changed my life. And I'll get into that in a second here on why that might be so. Had hundreds, probably over 1,000 environmental toxin levels tested. This started as a National Geographic story in 2006, where they had me tested for several hundred toxins. These are tiny, minute levels. Parts per billion, parts per trillion. And then they sent me out for National Geographic to find out where in my life I might have been exposed to some of these, which again I'll tell you about in a second, a couple of examples. Lots and lots of scans. In fact, I only violated the rule in my project, which is do no harm to me, twice. And once was getting a CT scan, which my doctor basically was not happy with because you're exposed to radiation. And as a healthy person, it's really advised against to get the CT scans. And also, you can find things like I did, false positives. I found a little bump. I had a chapter in the book called "Bumping My Kidney." Oh no! And fortunately, I was dealing with one of the world experts on using scanning technologies to find polyps and cysts on internal organs, and she immediately identified it as being harmless. But that isn't always the case. Sometimes you have to go through a lot of testing. And then proteomics, microbiomics, as I told you. And curiously enough, the cost here, since I did most of the testing about 5 years ago, the costs are about probably a quarter or less of what they were in those days. Now, this is not something that you're going to walk into your doctor and say, here, doctor, Medicare will pay for it. but we're certainly heading in the right direction there. And many of these tests are not that expensive if you want to get a battery of them. I have a whole talk on big data, which I call biobabble, too much data, too little understanding. But just to give you a little hint here, I'm well over 10 terabytes of data that I've collected on little old me. And if everybody on the planet had this much data collected, we would be into something called yottabytes. And you mathematicians out there, somebody's got to be able to tell me where yottabytes came from. I've looked it up. I cannot find. It's not Yoda, as in Star Wars, but yottabytes. And in fact, that's the last name, large number. If you go to the next derivation up, you don't have a name. But that's a lot of data. And just think about storage, about use of anywhere even close to that data. We're in zettabytes right now of data, which are rapidly increasing. I have some fellow testers who are, there's only about 3 or 4 of us that are in the terabyte territory. This is Mike Snyder at Stanford, nearby here, who's the head of genomic medicine there, and he's got something like 40 terabytes of data. And all I can say is, his data is bigger than mine, and I got to work on that. Another guy, an interesting character, is Larry Schmar, who is actually an engineer, but he runs the UC San Diego. It's kind of the equivalent of our QB3 up here. It's a fascinating institute and center that does everything from archaeology to bioengineering. And he has been testing his microbiome every day, or at least he was, every day for well over a year. And that's actually all the microbes on one day of his data and the different levels. And it changes, well, certainly daily, and he's even done it hourly at times, and it changes constantly. And there's a lot of information out there that suggests that the little critters inside of us have a lot more to do with our health and well-being and moods and everything else than we ever realized. Now, he's in the also 30 or 40 terabyte territory, which is really not fair. So what did I learn? I'll give you a quick little survey here. Obviously, lots and lots of data of the future me. And a couple of you who may have seen the talk have already seen this, but I try to put new things up to keep it interesting. So I had data that was useful, not useful, and who knows. So some of the useful data on the DNA stuff is what's called pharmacogenomics. And these are genetic tests that can tell you basically if a drug is safe or if it works. And this, in fact, is becoming very interesting and useful, especially for specific drugs like warfarin, which is blood thinner. I'm a hypermetabolizer of warfarin, as it turns out, genetically. And you don't want to give me the regular dose of warfarin, or I could get very, very sick or even die. And that's one that's been black boxed by the FDA, meaning it's recommended but not required. And so that's one, out of all of these tests, I probably would want to have tattooed on my body somewhere in case I'm unconscious, so the doctors would know. Another DNA test, which I'll talk about more in a second, mercury sensitivity. It's related to pharmacogenomics, but it's toxicogenomics, where toxins in the environment, every sort of environmental input, we all have our own personal kind of mix of genetics on how we deal with everything from sunlight to what we eat. And I'm slightly at risk for mercury, eating it, large fish, things like that. Alzheimer's was an MRI scan, very interesting. It's incredibly expensive and somewhat experimental, but it has a pretty good track record of predicting if you have Alzheimer's in your future by what's building up in your brain even before you show symptoms. I came out, fortunately, with no trace. I also have a low genetic risk for that, so the combination of those two is probably a pretty good indicator, hopefully, for me. People still get these things, even though these predictors say no, but at least the odds ratios, especially for this test, are quite good as a predictor. Not so useful. Actually, I'm up to over 400 heart attack results. According to these results, I am low, medium, and high risk for heart attack. Okay, you statisticians out there, you can see that should not be. And the reason is that almost all genetic data, even recent data, is individual markers. And it's population data where you have a population, in this case, some of whom have had heart attacks, some of whom haven't. You run statistical correlations. You find associations with particular gene markers, just single markers, that give you some probability for, or higher probability than average for a heart attack. Now you can tell right away that that's, when you start mixing these together, that they're not going to make a lot of sense. And at the moment, there's not great ways to weight these or to understand, which really work. And I've written a lot about that. And again, I'll give you a website at the end, by the way, and you can find out a lot more about this. Another one not so useful, there's some DNA around different moods and behavior. I apparently have a high risk for low empathy, but I don't really care about what you think. And then not sure. A lot of this environmental data, these trace amounts of toxins, the dose makes the poison in any chemical. And if I had a trace of plutonium in me, I'd be dead, and you all would be too. Some of these chemicals like DDT, this is no longer probabilities, by the way, on these percentages. This is actual levels which are taken. A national mean is taken every 2 years by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on several hundred toxins. And so I am 50% higher than the national mean for the metabolite that DDT breaks down into, which is DDE. And nobody really knows what that means. I'm obviously relatively healthy up here. I will tell you, though, how I got it, which is something that I wrote about in the geographic story. When I was a kid, I grew up in eastern Kansas, and they were spraying this stuff then, DDT. It's been banned for a long time. But they would come every year to our little community, which was around a lake. We had a lot of mosquitoes. And they would take a truck, and they'd open the back, and they'd have these little sprayers, and they'd spray DDT in a big cloud back behind the truck. And they told everybody to stay indoors, especially us kids. But of course, we snuck out with our bikes. We went riding in and out of the cloud. And so all these years later, it shows up in me. But again, don't really know what it means. And it's been dissipating in my body as well. The biological half-life in a human being for DDE is about 20 years. So I would have had even more on board as a kid. Environment, another environmental marker, flame retardants, 1,200% higher than the CDC mean. That's still apparently not that dangerous, but all of these, by the way, at high, very extreme levels, are deadly and cause cancer. Flame retardants is a thyroid disruptor. There are lots of nasty things. This probably, after we did a lot of work on this with some experts, it may be because I fly a lot, and this room is filled. Your clothes have flame retardants in them. That plane that crashed on the runway at SFO a few weeks back, you notice it was burning, but it didn't burn for a few minutes, and almost everybody got out. So you actually like flame retardants in that situation. But you're also, as you're sitting in those planes, you're breathing them in. And that's probably why I have higher levels, because I fly a lot. That's just one thought. Your body does get rid of those pretty quickly. Yeah, I know, who knows? Yeah, right, exactly. But I won't, you can light me on fire, but I won't burn. And then finally, I'm not sure here, there are lots of functional MRI scans where they show you pictures while you're in the scanner. You have these goggles on, and they're showing you all kinds of terrible things, people in accidents, and God knows what else. Soap operas, there's one on soap operas. And they see how your different parts of your brain lights up. Does it affect this part or that part, the memory? And so I ran a series of tests, or I participated in a series of tests at NYU on greed and altruism. And I came out normal for greed. Now, I don't really know what that means, and when I'm talking to business people, I get a sort of titter like, well, what is normal? You think of Gordon Gekko and Wall Street. Greed is good. So I don't know how he would come out on this test. I also came out normal in altruism, so there you go. Now, there's always a big question right now, and a lot of work being done, especially in companies that are coming up with ways to, say, help large corporations that self-insure. They have a huge motivation to save money, so how do you get people to lose weight? How do you get people to not smoke? How do you change behavior, essentially? And so there's a lot of work being done on this, and just to share with you a couple studies on genetics in trying to determine how people will respond to health conditions. It's very conflicting right now. Some say, the genetic tests work, some say they don't, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this, and a lot of work being done. Now, central message here with all this personalized health, and in fact, all of what I'm talking about here tonight, is the need for integration. And I'm sure you all, are aware of how many areas of science are beginning to come together. But I love this slide. It's my friend Eric Shadd at Mount Sinai, who is a triple PhD in, mathematics, statistics, and genetics. A really smart guy. He loaned me this slide, and you can see really when you start talking about things like genetics or even some of the proteomics, it's just the beginning of really what we need to know to understand and to be able to integrate into figuring out what's going on inside of our bodies. And there's another kind of way also to think of integration as trends, some of which I mentioned here. I imagine a day when three large trends will really come together, and that's when we get a big change in medicine. You start with big bio in medicine, traditional biomedicine as we practice it for a long time. You add in IT, which I've mentioned. The IT people now, they see fun with code, they see dollar signs, whatever they see. They're starting to jump into this in a big way. The biomedicine guys still going, whoa, what? Huh? What? Apps? Don't really get apps. We still write things on paper. And then you've got this wellness movement, consumers, the quantified self, whatever, people who take vitamins, basically try to take matters into their own hands. And this is essentially the sweet spot for personalized health. And it's beginning to form, but still has a long way to go. It's also, in my view, going to be the next trillion-dollar industry, that people that figure this out, that really link all these things together in a meaningful way. Another way to look at this, using that same kind of triangle, is what I'm calling the triad of life. And the triad of life is genes, environment, and phenotype, and using big data. And I'm about to show you an example of how a little company I started actually used this triad of life. Most of research right now is either one of these things, like, say, pharma studying a particular phenotype, or toxicologists who take an environmental toxin or dietary ingredient or something and see how it affects disease or well-being. Most of that work down here on the lower part is not related to genetics. It's just beginning to be. And in fact, what we really need to do with wrestling down all this big data is to take all the wonderful studies, especially from the lower part of the triangle, and connect it up with genetics. And that's in fact what a project I've been doing has been embarking on. And it's around mercury exposure. And this was one of the tests I took originally in experimental man, and I'll show you exactly what I did here. Mercury starts with coal. Almost all the mercury that gets inside of human beings starts in coal. It's burned in power plants. It gets into the atmosphere. This is a NASA image. That's China down there. You can actually see this is not weather. This is pollution coming across, and you can see where it's headed, right towards us. And in fact, there is a lot of mercury in there because there's a lot of coal-burning power plants. Now, I'm not picking on China here. If you put one of these maps over parts of the U.S., it would be just as dense, or Europe. We have had several decades to partially clean up our atmosphere, so I'm not picking on anybody here, but that is, in fact, the source of a lot of mercury that gets inside of particularly us here on the West Coast. Now, what I did for Experimental Man was I went out, and the book starts this way, the Experimental Man book, with me going out and catching a halibut off the coast of Bolinas, California. This is not that fish. Mine was a lot smaller. Couldn't find one small enough in Google Images. And anyway, I caught that fish, and then I went to the ferry building in San Francisco and bought a swordfish, which, of course, is the top of the food chain. And the mercury gets into the ocean, and it settles to the bottom. The little critters down there eat it. The little fish eat the little critters, and it goes right up the food chain. So these big fish, like swordfish, marlin, big tunas, actually the ones that you pay a lot of money for in restaurants, they tend to have a lot more mercury in them than the smaller fish. So I had the halibut for lunch and a swordfish for dinner, and did a before and after mercury level test. So here's what happened. Before, I went in the morning before I had this 2 meals, 4 parts per billion. That is just below the 5.2 parts per billion EPA threshold that's considered, to be a safety issue if you go over that. So after those 2 meals, here's what happened. I bumped up to 13 parts per billion. And that's called a fish gorge, and again, my doctor got very upset when this is the second time, and there was not a third that I violated my don't do harm to me. And in fact, this is what happens when you eat large fish, and especially women of childbearing age. All of you know, at least most of you probably know, that there are FDA suggestions on how much fish to eat, especially if you're pregnant. And this is a huge problem, and the FDA is about to release a whole new round of levels of mercury in different species of fish. I've seen some of the preliminary data. It's actually going to be higher than it was the last time they did this survey about 10 years ago. So kind of scary. But in the spirit of integration, I didn't just stop with, okay, what's my level of mercury? In the book, in fact, in many instances, I tried to see, as an individual, what can all of this data tell me, or at least parts of it? How do I integrate this in me? And it could be you. I'm the everyman here, in a way. So I went out and looked to see if there's any genetics connected with mercury exposure. Didn't really expect to find all that much, but it turns out when you enter a new silo, toxicologists have been working on this for decades. And in fact, there is a fair amount of data on this. And this is where you see that triad working. Remember I was talking about that? So in this case, you've got mercury. There's been a lot of data that's collected on neurobehavioral effects and other problems around mercury exposure. And then you add the genetics, so you have that whole triad. And this, in fact, these are 4 genetic markers that I had myself tested for to see if I have sensitivity to mercury. And I'm slightly elevated risk in one of them. And by the way, the sources of mercury, as I said, are fish. And the other one, anybody have those silver fillings in your mouth? Yeah, I do. Those have mercury in them too. They're 50% mercury. And every time you're chewing gum, like this, there's a little bit of mercury vapor coming out of there. If they're old, though, there's not much left, so I guess hopefully the damage hasn't been done. But anyway, so this is what I did in the book. But then in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been moving more and more towards doing some entrepreneurial work. And in fact, I co-founded a company that's taking this idea of what we call ecogenetics, basically that triad. And we're leveraging big data, huge studies that others have done, and we're genotyping the subjects and coming up with sensitivity markers. And we have a test called My Mercury that's going to be coming out in the spring. And just to give you an idea of the pervasiveness of mercury, this is actually 2008. I've got to get a newer map here, but you can see we're in fact in a hot spot right here, but it tracks the industrial parts of the world where you burn coal. Huge, huge problem. And for this particular mercury instance, we leveraged a big trial that the NIH funded, $50 million clinical trial that took 500 children between 7 and 17, and for 7 years, once a year, they were tested for mercury levels, and then were administered a whole battery of neurobehavioral tests. And half of them were given amalgam fillings, those half mercury fillings, and half were not. Now, I find that a little crazy. They still put 30 million of these silver fillings in kids' mouths in the United States alone. But this was legal to do this, even though you're exposing kids to mercury. And the original study, by the way, which was published in JAMA in 2006, found no difference between those two groups, the neurobehavioral tests. But this is impersonalized medicine. This is the past. This was an average. A couple of the researchers looking at the data said, wait a minute, this isn't right. So they went back and genotyped all these kids, and this is what they found out. 1 in 5 of these kids, if they're exposed to mercury, and that's a big if, have neural development deficits. It's actually not up to 3 years, it's an average of 3 years. It can be worse. And great effect sizes, low p-values, and affects boys more than girls, interestingly enough. And just a little deeper dive into this, because I find this really fascinating. This is all the 500 kids and their neural developmental trajectories, from age 7 to 17. And in this group on the left, the reds are the kids who are high risk, and the blues are the kids who have a normal risk. You can see if you're not exposed to mercury here, the reds are right mixed in with the blues. There's not a big difference there. But when you're exposed to very small amounts of mercury, this is way below that safety threshold. It's 2, 3, 4 parts per million. You can see what happens. They drop down. Some of those kids flatline, these high-risk kids. So anyway, this is interesting use of big data. This just tells you about it a little bit differently. The kids who have a low genetic risk test normally at age 17. If you're medium risk, you have some of the markers. You're testing at age 14, and then a very tiny percentage of kids who are very high risk are testing at age 11 for these neurobehavioral tests. Again, the triad of life, which I sort of like that concept as a writer. This is how you put Mercury in there. So I'm continuing to do experiments, and this is actually my stem cell line. There's a group up in Wisconsin, a stem cell pioneer named James Thompson. Actually, I sent some blood to him. This is a little progression. He reverse engineered my white blood cells into stem cells, very similar to embryonic stem cells. The type of cells, by the way, that grow into every cell in the body. Embryonic stem cells appearing just a few days after conception. And for you that aren't familiar with this technology, it's called induced pluripotent stem cells. And this is a hot new technology that basically you can take any cell in the body, reverse it back to embryonic-like cells, and then grow any cell in the body. And in this case, we grew heart cells. And I don't have a video here. Oh, actually, maybe I do. Let's see if we can make this work. Nope. No. Anyway, there's a video version of this where you can see these little guys beating. And these are my heart cells in a Petri dish, which beat. And if you leave them in there for a little while, they're programmed to start growing together. So they move in the Petri dish together, and they start forming little bits of your heart, which is almost getting kind of freakish. Yeah, weird. Anyway, and what we did with this is a technology review, MIT technology review story that I wrote, where we used this, a healthy person again, using this technology to see how various drugs might affect my heart cells. And in the future, this is way too expensive and experimental right now, but in the future, if you need to have chemotherapy or a drug that is known to affect cardiomyocytes, you might get a test like that with your own stem cell line that can tell you, and you can see this is with Gleevec. As you increase the dose of Gleevec, my cells basically were badly affected, although it was fairly normal according to the data. And then we're continuing to do the stem cell. This is part of the experimental man is continuing. These are neurons. These are not my neurons. I'm waiting for my neurons. Up in Wisconsin, they are making them as we speak. And we're going to run all kinds of freakish and crazy experiments on this, including, by the way, some genetic engineering of my brain cells. And I'm hoping that they don't drug me and stick these in my brain to see what happens, because some of these people I know would like to do that. Now, in my academic work, which I'm not really getting much into here, it's all around policy and kind of what happens when you get these technologies and how our society deals with it. But I just wanted to show you that there is a website here, and I'll put this up again at the end, where we did a big study for the Kauffman Foundation on the gaps in solutions to getting us towards this world of personalized health. All right, now the fun stuff. Just do this pretty quickly here. Human enhancement. Again, a series in the New York Times I've been working on, how science can build a better you. There's some other aspects of this. And in fact, the idea of enhancement is already all around us. And a number of therapies that are really on the leading edge right now, which of course are being created for people who have impairments or disease, many of them are already starting to push into use by healthy people to enhance. And this is Amy Mullins. I used to have Oscar Pistorius up here, but she looks better, and he killed somebody. So, and I've gotten to know Amy. She was also a track star, amazing. She has 16 pairs of legs. She had a congenital situation where she lost her legs. She's now a model and an actress. Said one of the great things is if she's with a leading man who's tall, she can be tall. If she's with a leading man who's short, she can be short. So she considers herself enhanced. And exoskeletons is another interesting area. This is still pretty clunky these days, but I think we'll all have these to do yard work and all kinds of stuff in the future. Using stem cell technologies, very, very experimental, but this is an esophagus that was grown and actually implanted. I don't think this one in particular, but a few of these have been implanted into human beings, into children. Bladders as well. These are incredibly simple organs. They don't have much of a vascular system like a heart or a liver, but this is being done right now. These are replacement organs that are grown using that technology I showed you a minute ago with stem cells. You have genetics, you have drugs, By the way, the drugs is interesting. I wrote a somewhat controversial article for the Times about Adderall, the stimulant, and the fact that millions of healthy people, millions, are using these. Students, pilots, people who need to stay up all night, probably a couple lawyers in Wilson Santini. I'm not saying that, but people are using this. The stories about addiction and all of that are actually interesting because there isn't a lot of evidence, in fact, that most people, there is a small percentage of people that seem to have addictive behavior that are addicted to drugs like this. It may be that this actually works, if you use it, expeditiously, but we don't have any way of testing it because ethically you can't test drugs like this on healthy people. And I almost think, this is where I start becoming a commentator, I almost think it's unethical not to test it when you have millions of people trying it. And steroids are too. I mean, we all go, ooh, steroids, and we think of various athletes like Barry Bonds. But in fact, again, millions of people are using these. It doesn't seem to be harming them really. We don't know because they're not being adequately tested, but certainly you're not getting these horrible effects that you hear about all the time from these different drugs. I would like to know, personally, I mean, maybe they are dangerous, but we don't really know. And then you've got things like cochlear implants. This is my buddy Mike Koros, who one day was walking down the street and went deaf, and now he's not because he has a little computer in his brain, which allows him to hear. This gentleman, Matthew Nagel, who I did a story on for NPR, has a brain implant. He was in an accident, became paralyzed from the neck down, and he was able to play games, change the TV channel, turn on and off the lights using thought coming out of that machine. Doesn't work very well, but imagine what that might be in the future. In fact, there's now even some exterior electrodes that are beginning to be able to allow you to do some of those things. I had to throw this up as issues when I'm talking about these things. First of all, this technology is coming. I mean, this is like a lot of technology, you can't really stop it once it's up and running. We need to make some decisions about this. It's always interesting, you software people out there, who controls this software? And I always wonder what happens. I mean, how often does your computer crash? You really wouldn't want that to happen if it's controlling large parts of your body, especially your brain. There's some Frankenstein issues, whole talk I could give on ethical issues, and part of that is what it means to be human. And there's a huge debate, transhumanists and others talking about this all the time. And then finally, I'll wind up here with where all this is heading. We might actually get a day of radical longevity. And just a quick note about the book you have. That is an e-book, is why you don't have a real book. Maybe it is a real book, but it's not a physical book. And this is actually new radical technology in my business of publishing, where you're beginning to have these exclusive e-books. And that little card you have has a little scratch thing on the back, and you just got a free book, and it downloads to your Kindle or your Nook. Makes it a little weird when you have book signings, but I can sign it for you if you really want the card. So here we go. How did you vote? This is the results of about, it says 33,000. It's actually more like 40,000. And we have a website, 164.com, where you can go and vote, and it tabulates things as people vote. And so you guys were a little off here, but again, we're in the valley. 80 years was around 60%, 120 years around 30%, 150 years was 9 or 10, and then forever, it's about 1%, except the people who are voting online, the forever people, because I know who's voting, are more than half of the people voting. So those percentage keeps going up on the chart online because 80-year-old people want to live to be 80, apparently don't care enough to vote. So that's the online survey right there. And I encourage you all to go vote. We're also collecting, you put your real age in there and then the age, like say 100 or whatever, that you prefer to live. And I have some charts on that which are kind of interesting. So we've been running this experiment in radical longevity actually a long time, even before all these new technologies kicked in. If you go back to 1900, you can see the average life expectancy was in the early 40s. Even if you survived childhood, you were still into the 50s. If you go back in the 19th century or before, it was even less than that. And right now, 2013, as I said, we're at around 80 in the U.S. Some places it's even longer life expectancy. But the curious thing about this UN chart is going to 2150. maybe some of us will be around to see this, it keeps going up. And this is not really considering all these crazy technologies I'm about to tell you about, and some of which I've already told you about. But you can see the trajectory. Women in the developed world by 2200 or so, 2150, are topping out an average life expectancy of 100. And even in the developed world, which are the two lower lines of the graph, you're still talking about people well into their 80s, 90 years old. So, who knows? I don't know exactly how they came up with this, but it is kind of interesting that the experiment's already being run.
What's MDW?
What's that?
What was MDW?
MDW, let's see, that's the developed world. Males, developed world?
More developed?
More developed. Yeah, more developed. Yeah, sorry, yes. Thank you. Thank you, MIT people, for knowing what my own slide says. Yeah, more. Yeah, that's funny. I never really actually looked at that. Lower developed world, more developed. Doesn't sound like a very scientific description. Anyway. So the 4 ways in the book, I have really short chapters, it's a really short book. There are 4 ways that the experts say that we might extend lifespan. And the first one is healthy living. And in fact, most of this life expectancy increase that we've had up to date is not through technology. It's through better hygiene, better nutrition, just living a healthier life. And that's one of the reasons why those numbers keep going up globally, because more and more people, despite obesity and some other issues here in the U.S., more and more people are just living a healthier life. And I found that fascinating with all this money and expense and brilliance that we're using to come up with new technologies, that this is still the most prevalent, or at least the thing that has gotten us this far, so far. We've also got genetics. This is actually showing you some telomere technology, and telomeres are the ends of your genes that supposedly as they get shorter, it tells you if you're going to live longer or not, which is only partially true in humans so far. But genetics is an interesting part of this whole equation because there is a lot of evidence in lower organisms that you can extend lifespan through some genetic fixes. And again, more on this if you want to check it out in some of my writings on a website I'll give you in a second. Bionics, I showed you the gentleman before. This is an update in that technology using brain implants to control machines. Stem cell technologies, this is actually a cornea grown with stem cells that restored sight to that person. Reasons why you might want to live to be 150 or not. So these are some of the reasons, and I did a survey on this. You might want to live to be 150. You spend more time with your friends and family. You can learn to play the piano like you always wanted to because you're 120 and you still got another 30 years. So why not? You never got around to it before. Some geniuses might still be alive, even though, Einstein I think would be about 135 at this point. Of course, you also get people like Stalin might be around. It can work both ways. You get to see the future. That's another one. A lot of people are very excited about living a long time. Now, this is the one area that I personally would like to find out what's going to happen in the future. I've always been excited about that. I'm not sure if I really want to live like 5,000 years to find out, but that is a major reason. And then finally, why wouldn't people want to live to be 150? And again, there's sections in the book about this. One, of course, is the fear of being frail for a very long time. Who wants to be old and decrepit longer than you have to be? And most people vote for 80. In fact, when you ask them, that's their biggest fear. They really don't believe that there will be a fix, except that there might be some way to keep them alive in a way that they wouldn't want to live. And health span, as they call it, or staying healthy, is a big part of what people would want to have if they're extending lifespan. And this is Jean Clément, who I was telling you about. Now, if I showed a picture of her at 80 or 90, she actually looks like she's about 50. And when you see a picture of her at 50, she looks like she's about 15. And so this is interesting. People are studying why some people age so slowly. And it's not well understood, but clearly we have a big variation among humans. A lot of people worry about how are they going to pay for living all those extra years. A lot of billionaires here in our region, they love to fund all these longevity projects, but you got $1 billion, I guess you don't have to worry so much about how you're going to pay to live forever. Although you do get things that interfere, which I'll show you in a second, like, say, crashes of the markets, things like that might affect even those people. There's overpopulation and resource depletion. This is a big one that a lot of people talk about. Wars, depression. These things have a way of interfering. The longer you live, the more of a chance you'll have it. This is Superstorm Sandy. You probably have more of those in your future if you live a very long time. Some people complain that they'll be bored. I don't really get this one, but actually that's a pretty big one for a lot of people. They just think, what am I going to do with all that extra time? I don't know. I wish I had an extra hour each day, but apparently a lot of people don't agree with that. And then I don't know what that is. Okay. Anyway, in the end, though, back to the almost first picture I showed you, all of this really comes back to radical life extension. All of this is about being able to help individuals in our lives, other people, in a personal way. My family, it could be your family. It's really important when you talk about all this high technology that you don't really lose focus when you're talking about life sciences. So this is about real people and real people that you care about. And I certainly wouldn't want to live to be 164 or 150 without having people that I love and my friends around. And I'll just leave you with that thought. After this, how long do you want to live? You can fill in the blank. So thank you. I don't know if we have, I kind of went pretty long there. Do we have time for a question or two? Or? Okay. And these are some websites, by the way, that I mentioned.
I'm going to preface this. The fact that I know everyone's going to laugh at me, but remember when you were talking about that performance enhancing, I don't know if it was a drug that a lot of people are using.
Right.
And they don't know if it's addictive or not. I missed the name of that.
Oh, it was Adderall.
Adderall.
Yeah, Adderall.
Adderall.
Yeah, it's a sort of fancy amphetamine that it's given for ADHD and some other, mostly attention deficits, sometimes for depression. But it's become really, if you go to colleges now, these surveys are saying as many as 20% of the kids admit, in anonymous surveys, that they use it occasionally, like to get them through finals or something like that. And it's hard to talk about these things because we're not supposed to even think about encouraging that kind of behavior, certainly, and I'm not encouraging that kind of behavior, but it is interesting that so many people have taken it, admitted to taking it. A lot of psychiatrists are beginning to study it. These people are not addicted. It doesn't seem to be really affecting them. In fact, the only time the detriment that I hear about for the few people who have studied it, if you take it more than 2 or 3 times in a row, you start having problems about staying up too long. But that's the major side effect that they're getting here. So the question there is, what do we do about it? Because there are other drugs like this. In fact, there's several coming up that are similar for various neuro conditions that'll be similar to the Adderall situation. What do we do about these drugs? Because kids get them, or people get them. It's not just kids, by the way, it's everybody. A lot of people use these. So, we aren't really addressing that as a society. It's just, don't take them is what the message is. Yep.
They said that they're developing things like bladder out of stem cells.
Yep.
Where's that work being done? You said it's just experimental, or?
Well, the bladder work, the leading authority on this is a guy named Anthony Atala, who is at Wake Forest in, North Carolina. And you can Google him. He's done TED Talks and all of that. It's really quite remarkable. They've implanted, I think, a dozen or a couple dozen kids, and it's been written up in journals. It's still really tough. I mean, even when you have, there's not the classic rejection problem because you're using a child's own, genetics, but it's still very difficult to get this technology to work. But people with animals are working with patches for, say, hearts. Brains have not worked out so well yet, but livers, kidneys, it's not really been tried in humans that we know of. But that kind of technology may be available fairly soon, where you have a heart attack and you damage a part of your heart, and you introduce these pluripotent stem cells, these induced pluripotent stem cells, your own genetics, like the ones I had, and you're able to patch a heart. The main thing keeping it from happening right now is there's still some mutations that occur with the engineering process of creating these cells. And depending on who you talk to, it's being worked out. Other people think it will continue. So in other words, you might trigger cancer or some other condition by putting these cells in. So that's, the FDA and others haven't really encouraged a lot of this, at least use in humans yet. Well, those things are, but this technology was only invented in 2007. So the fact that it's moving this fast is pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, just a comment on the longevity statistics. As a historian, you probably know that part of the reason that figures were so low for so long was that small children were not living through the age of 1 or even to 5. Right. Which brought down the adults. But if you survived that, you had a pretty good shot at living a long time. We sort of forget that these days, but it's worth factoring into the thought process.
Absolutely. In fact, I was talking really fast, but I did say that if you survived childhood, even in 1900, you lived into your 50s rather than your 40s. But in fact, that's a really good point. And the way these statistics work is, as you get older, your life expectancy actually goes up a little bit until obviously a certain point where it doesn't. But even people who turn 80, will most likely, I think it's 88 is the life expectancy. So, if you made it to 80, you'll probably make it a little bit farther. So, yeah, I mean, just those raw statistics like that are a little, aren't entirely accurate, like a lot of statistics, without really understanding what goes into them. You also get interesting phenomenon. We were talking about this earlier. The UN now does life expectancy figures for every country on the planet, and that spread is kind of interesting. The lowest life expectancy in the world is Angola, and mostly because of AIDS, and they have a lot of still guerrilla wars and things. It's 32 years old. And the highest life expectancy, I already got somebody to guess this. It's a tiny little country with a lot of wealthy people. Can anybody guess? Monaco, exactly. 92 years old. So I guess, I don't know, being a rich playboy or playgirl on the beach in Monaco with a lot of money and gambling every night, who knows? Maybe we should all try it.
Why does Goa have such a low success?
What's that, Angola?
No, did you say Angola?
Angola. Yeah, and some of the other really long-lived countries, we're probably, I have to go back and look, I think we're something like 30-something, the U.S. Scandinavian countries are up there, partly because their healthcare, and they're also a pretty homogeneous population. Japan, especially, Okinawans, for instance, are among the longest-lived people in the world. There are little pockets around the world, some valleys like in northern Pakistan, weirdly enough. There's some areas in the Andes where people live allegedly even longer than Jean Clement. In fact, give you a little tip here. My next book is going to be a novel which takes that concept, and you find the genetics behind a valley in the mountains between Tibet and India where people live hundreds of years. And I'm working with geneticists and others, and this is not impossible that this could actually occur. So it's called The Cure, the novel. So look for it if I ever get it done. Yeah.
My main question is where the thought of the individual plays into this. I was reminded that Kelly McGonigal from Stanford University, in a very recent TED Talk, cited a startling study. And I'll just give you two stats from the study. It found that it was a study on stress. It found that, thank you, the stress study found that mortality rates didn't increase in those who had stress, but those who believed stress would be harmful to them. And in fact, they found those who reported high stress but didn't believe it harmful had a lower risk of dying than those who reported low stress. So the question is, and I should point out during the course of this study, the researchers estimated 182,000 people died solely because of the belief that stress was bad for them. So my question is, where does the thought of the individual play into all of this?
Well, this is all about the individual, and in fact, finding out why that is would be very interesting, and I hope these researchers are looking into that. And we all know the power of mind over matter, really. I mean, there are completely unexplained cases of people willing themselves to be cured of diseases they shouldn't be able to cure themselves from. I mean, we don't really, there's so little understanding of how that works. It's very interesting, though, because there are studies that tell you that a small to medium amount of stress is actually probably good for you. Not chronic, not extreme stress over a long period of time. But this goes with, we were talking earlier, too, about eating dirt. I mean, apparently it's okay, or in fact, it's probably, your kids should be exposed to a little bit of dirt. We put them in bubbles now, these sterile bubbles, because that triggers the immune systems in the body to be able to deal, with various toxins and other things that they might come into contact later. And this may be a reason why, asthma is very high. I was just hearing from somebody. So it's interesting. I think our body is designed to deal with these environmental inputs and perturbations. And in fact, sometimes you need to trigger that machinery like an antibody response to get the effects. And if you don't trigger that, when you actually do have the environmental insult, your defenses aren't primed to deal with it. So that may be a case. This is an area that I find fascinating, and unfortunately, it's still not really being well researched. Yep.
Don't you think that Big Brother and the people who do your credit scores and what your Facebook passwords would be really interested in your genome, your proteome, your brain waves, your heart rhythms throughout the day? Isn't it time for some kind of privacy thing equivalent to a constitutional amendment to stop people from getting this?
Well, I hope the NSA isn't listening right now. I mean, we think it's crazy that they're taking our cell phone records. Imagine them like hacking into our genomics or whatever. And apparently, there's not a lot to stop them from the phone records. I don't know. This is an area of a guy who writes about policy that is huge right now, and everybody is concerned about it. The reality is that in a world of digitization, we already know this with bank records. I mean, every time I go online and, my bank records are all sitting there online like I'm sure yours are. I mean, you wonder, some guy in Siberia or wherever, North Dakota, am I going to be the one he hacks into today? And I'm not sure that we can really protect ourselves, to be honest with you. In fact, there's only been one law in Congress passed around genetic protections of these kind. It was called the, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which was passed in 2007, right after 23andMe and some of the genetic testing companies came online. And this does outlaw, or at least fine heavily, employers and health insurance companies for discriminating using genetic information. And there have been many problems with that. One of them is the fines aren't really that bad, and you need to have more teeth. But that's probably what you need to do. I mean, we come after people, say, for fire. Fire is a good thing when it's used well. When you use it to burn down a house or you're an arsonist, we put those people in jail. So maybe that's one way to deal with it. Now, even GINA, though, didn't cover an awful lot of things. It doesn't cover the NSA. It doesn't cover law enforcement. It doesn't cover like universities, like Berkeley, my university that got in deep trouble about 3 years ago for secretly genotyping some of the freshmen coming in on an experiment around alcoholism. And they thought, wow, this would be really good information. Well, they didn't ask. But that was actually legal. And it still is legal. Yeah.
In your survey of how long people want to live, do you also collect information as to those people's general sense of well-being of themselves? And if so, do you see any correlation? For example, better well-off people want to live longer. If not, will you collect those information later in your survey?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
Oh, if you didn't collect that information, will you include it in your survey later on?
Well, I more or less did. I was asking why or why not people would want to live. And there is a little section of the book on techno-optimists. And a lot of the people I hang out with, and I'm sure many of you are in this category. In fact, I really consider myself mostly a techno-optimist. But they, I'll go to one of these longevity meetings, and they look at me like I'm insane for even questioning this. Why wouldn't you want to? I mean, you end suffering. In their view, it's ending suffering. You get to play with a lot of cool new technological toys, which of course they're into. And why wouldn't you want this? So it's not even a matter of what it would be like for them, or it's almost a given that would be what they wanted. Now, people are more in between, or maybe a little more ambivalent about it. I think under certain circumstances. It's when you talk to them, or I did this survey, they might want to extend lifespan a bit, but most people don't. Most people think that there is a beginning, middle, and end of life. And curiously enough, I don't know if people here are religious at all, got very few people out of the thousands I talked to, maybe it's who I was talking to, that talked about an afterlife that wouldn't involve science, like in a religious context. But it's interesting. Again, how much effort we're putting in to extend lifespan and to keep people healthy, when the vast majority of people seem to be okay with the current lifespan, as long as they're healthy. Maybe a couple more questions? Let's see. Yeah.
So what do you know about these people, I guess they call them cronies, the calorie restriction people?
Yep.
Trying to extend the life, and also the issue with this human growth factor 2 and cancer.
Right. Yeah, he was asking about caloric restriction first. And you may have heard of this. In some lower organisms, when they're stressed through, food or water or, temperature, a lot of organisms go into a semi-dormant state at a cellular level. And it started with worms and flies, and this essentially extends lifespan for these organisms. The problem is, as you move up, into higher and higher, or more complex, not higher, but more complex organisms like mice, monkeys, humans. This effect of, reducing calories in this case, these stresses have a lesser effect. And there is a caloric restriction, I forget if it's institute or association or something, and there are a group of people who for many years now have reduced their caloric intake. And the idea is that this triggers this sort of defensive machinery at the cellular level, which extends lifespan. And there's never been really hard evidence on this in humans, but there are a lot of people who believe it. And in fact, there is some evidence when people go on diets, they get healthier, and that does impact life expectancy. There were some recent experiments, though, that with rhesus monkeys, one that was completed that was 25 years, and they didn't get much of an effect. And rhesus are pretty close to us from an evolutionary standpoint. So the jury is really still out. Although the ultimate question is, do you want to starve yourself? I think they're at about, I forget what it is, 70% or something of calories. It's still, yeah, okay. So you're still a nutritional level, and I've eaten with them, and they're like eating single peas. Like a piece of lettuce, and they're like, and I, of course, went out, I think, to In-N-Out afterward. No, I'm kidding. But do you want to starve yourself to maybe get a couple percentage points added to your lifespan? So that's a big question. Now, there are some drugs being developed that might mimic this and, again, enhance this effect. Still in early stage trials. They're being tested for things like diabetes, which are disease of aging. So we'll see. We may be able to still get this effect in some way. Yeah, maybe a couple more? Yeah.
Yes, I had a question, but first, this doesn't seem to be on. Hi, I had a question, but first I wanted to respond to the point about your mention of the GINA legislation.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole bunch of exceptions so that insurance companies can use that data. So they were not blocked. So it's really a bad example of very quickly drafted legislation that doesn't do what most of us would want to see. My real question was about things like certains and how we test these things. And when you do the survey, it's very dependent on people's expectations as to what quality of life would look like. Because in the last century, we've essentially had 30 years added on to average life expectancy.
Right.
And most of that is successful aging, except in the last, period of time subject to discussion. But also then looking at the people who are considered to be more successfully aging into their 90s. So there's, I was wondering if you've had a chance to look at that and people who are doing genomics on those people.
There is a lot of research being done on, especially centenarians, people who live over 100. I mean, it used to be you had a few thousand people in the U.S., smaller population, but I think it's almost 40,000 centenarians now, and they're talking about, you look at those numbers from the UN chart, you're going to have hundreds of thousands soon here. And there's a big project going on. Actually, Eric Topol, the gentleman that wrote the book I was mentioning, who's at Scripps, is doing a big study on centenarians. There have been some done at other universities. And there has been some interesting findings. One of them is that these families of very long-lived people, and I'm not quite in the centenarian category of my family, but almost everyone in my family lives well into their 90s. We've had a few over 100. So this might include my family. But they seem to get the same number of diseases. They even have the same number of high-risk variants on heart attack, cancer. But there's other genetic pathways that seem to be overriding that. So they might still get asthma or diabetes or something, but it doesn't kill them, and it doesn't become nearly as severe as in other people. But there's still a lot of work to be done on that, and that may end up being one day a key to developing drugs, even some genetic therapies. But that's the sort of work that's being done. But really, even without that, as this gentleman suggested, I remember even as a little kid, it was old to be 65. And it's not old to be 65 now. I'm getting up there, and even at my age, in my mid-50s, people, it used to be old. You were heading towards the end. And when Social Security was first introduced in the 30s, and they set that 65 age category, I mean, almost nobody lived that long, which has got some economic implications these days, with a lot more people living. But now, when I was a little kid, people lived into their 70s, now easily into their 80s, and you're starting to get a lot of people into their 90s. And there is quality of life there with many of these people. So, it definitely is changing, and it's changing our view of all this. I mean, if you told somebody in 1860, that you'd have a bunch of 80-year-olds running around, they would have looked at you like you were crazy. It wasn't even something they would have considered. Yeah.
Can you comment on Calico?
Calico?
Yeah.
Calico?
Google's spin-off company?
Oh, yes. You know what? I should know more about it, but I don't. I'll look into it, though.
Just
Is this the new one?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I need to,
see if this works.
yes.
With respect to that societal issue, when FDR signed it, life expectancy was in the United States around 52, and there was, on the order of like 30 to 1 carrying that. This, living to 80s, 90s, 100, what have you, this idea that suddenly, at 65, things just suddenly magically change and we go into this nirvana vacation mode, except that we no longer can afford it. And the other thing is that we're recognizing as we're getting quality of life issues is our expectations are higher. We want to be productive. We want to be, part of the thing. We don't want to be, sitting in a rocking chair. And, I think that's missing a little bit from this whole debate as to this quality of life, as to saying, well, wait a second, if you don't want to, and that companies shouldn't be sort of enforcing these arbitrary, putting one foot in the grave and pushing out the door, I think that's got to become sort of part of it, because otherwise what we're looking at is by 2030, half the federal budget will go to Medicare and Social Security, and that's unsustainable.
Well, yes, and I was just suggesting a minute ago, when these programs, even Medicare in the 60s, nobody would dream that we would be having this number of people, living as long as they do. And, clearly, this is political suicide to bring these things up. In some of the European countries where the retirement age is even lower, where these programs kick in, like France, they have riots when you they tried to raise, I think Sarkozy tried to raise from 62 to 63, which would save them a bundle of money in France. They had riots, he had to back off. So, people do expect this, and not only personally, but politically. They work their whole lives, they paid into these funds, and they expect to get the benefits. But a great bioethicist named Daniel Callahan, who used to run the Hastings Institute, who's himself in his mid-80s, he said, could it be that we've had all this technology, spent all this money, so people can play golf longer? I think that's partly a good issue, although there are really more compelling statistics that, in fact, most people can't afford to do that. And you have people who are living, or who are continuing to work and not getting that sort of, paradise of retirement, playing golf and all of that. Most people, in fact, are having to work into their 60s, some people even beyond. So, I think you're getting dueling trends there, and that will probably become more the trend. I think even people who are affluent, who like to work, like their jobs, like my dad, he's in his early 80s, he's still practicing architecture. He doesn't have any plans to stop. So, I think it is a personal issue at this point, but for many people, it's not even that. They really have to. Right, yeah.
You put those UN curves of projected life expectancy up there. They went out to 2150.
Yeah.
And they didn't look like just swags, simple extrapolations and smooth curves. They had that's the possible basis for them.
Well, actually, if I can find it, I could send you, or you can actually Google the UN population study 2150, and you'll probably, it's a long, detailed study, and that's assuming that there'll be wars and depression and things like that, depressions. And in fact, we were talking about this earlier, but life expectancy doesn't just go up even in the past. The data we already know, it fluctuates. I mean, the general trend is upward, but they're extrapolating into that these same kind of incidents. So, do you believe it? Who knows? I mean, could we really know, in 2150 what the world population will be? Who knows? You guys, maybe some statisticians out there can explain how we can know that.
Okay, let me ask one more question. You mentioned how you hear people, when you go to business people, you talk about another $1 trillion industry for the sweet spot of your medical issues and applications, et cetera. Is that in addition to the current expenditures on healthcare in this world in the country today, or is that going to replace a piece of it?
I think both. Hopefully it's going to do a lot more replacing than adding, although technology has a funny way in medicine of actually costing more, whereas in most areas, like electronics and all the other areas that we can think of, it actually usually lessens the cost of things. But and again, there's not a lot of great work on this, although there are a couple of new programs in the federal government on what do they call it? Evidence-based medicine, basically, where you're trying to find out if you can predict somebody has a high risk for, say, diabetes, and you can take preventive measures or to at least slow that down. Obviously, on an individual basis, you're going to make a person healthier and save money. There's still not a lot of evidence that it's going to save money in the future. Everyone hopes it will, but we'll have to see. At the moment, we're keeping a lot more people healthier a lot longer, and it's costing a hell of a lot of money. So, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Anyway.
Yeah, there was a famous study out of Harvard Medical School of Public Health in the late 70s that predicted if we get people to cut back on alcoholism and smoking, it actually is going to cost the Social Security system more. And in fact, it does.
We keep people, 75% of the $2.7 trillion we spend on healthcare in the U.S., 75% of it goes to chronic care. And that's actually pretty new. I mean, in the old days, you died, if you got something. And, you got sick quickly if you got cancer or heart disease. And that's the part that, I mean, when I talk to business people and we really tease this out, reducing that number is really the key here. And keeping people who are going to be chronic, no matter what you do, they have a high risk for diabetes or something, keeping them from being expensive chronic care patients who actually have a pretty miserable life, keeping that from happening longer is really the key here, if you want to really break it down. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.